Hi, and now we're going to look at part 2, and we're going to look at more current perspectives about abnormal behavior. We had just looked at the way back, how they looked at abnormal behavior, and now we're going to look at more current ones. And that will finish up chapter 1. If you've got any feedback to provide about what I'm doing in this course, please make sure you ask questions. And make sure you have your textbook, highlight, write your notes, and you'll be all set and ready for this course. You'll be able to do very well and do well on your test. If you've got any questions about the assignment, please ask. Don't forget about your checklist. Alrighty, everybody, good luck, and let's carry on with this part 2 of chapter 1.
Now, getting started on the current perspective of abnormal behavior, we're going to look at 4 different perspectives. Abnormal behavior may be viewed from various contemporary perspectives. It's really started to branch out more. The first one we can look at is the biological perspective. The biological perspective incorporates the medical model, but it refers more broadly to approaches that relate to abnormal behavior to biological processes and apply biologically based treatments. And then when we move to the second variety, which is psychological perspectives, and the psychodynamic perspective. Now, I know the term psychodynamic is more related to Freud and his school of thought in psychology, and it reflects the view that Freud and his followers, who believe that abnormal behavior stem from psychological causes involving underlying psychic forces. Now, we'll go into this a lot further when we move forward. Now, in the same perspective as psychological are the learning theorists, and they posit that the principles of learning can be used to explain both abnormal and normal behavior. Now, the third sort of group that falls within a psychological perspective is behavior therapy, and it's an outgrowth from the learning model. And then there's the humanistic and existential theorists that believe that it's important to understand the obstacles that people encounter as they strive towards self-actualization and authenticity. Cognitive theorists focus on the role of distorted and self-defeating thinking in explaining abnormal behavior. And that's a fairly large perspective in terms of a lot of work that's been done in that way, and it's a crossover from psychology to see how it applies to abnormal. There's a third and newer version called sociocultural perspective, and these theorists believe that abnormal behavior is rooted in social ills. You know, things like poverty, societal stresses, the institutionalized prejudice that exists, and discrimination. Not in the individual as an individual, but as a society as a whole has an impact on abnormal behavior. They believe that to eliminate abnormality, one must first correct the societal problems that cause it. Some sociocultural theorists argue that mental illness is a myth because it stigmatizes people who don't conform to the prevailing social standards. And then the last group we're going to look at is what's called the interactionalist perspective. And today many theorists believe that multiple factors are interacting in complex ways that are involved in the development of abnormal behavior patterns. The leading interactionalist model is known as the diathis stress model. It posits that some people have a predisposition, this is what's known as the diathis, for particular disorders. But whether these disorders actually develop depends on the type and the severity of the stressors that they experience in life. So let's begin with the biological. Once we've completed that, we'll move to psychological, the sociocultural perspective, and then interactionalists. When we consider the biological perspectives incorporate the medical model, but more broadly affect the larger area of biological processes. And they apply these biological processes in terms of the treatment. The big influences are the advances in genetics, epigenetics, and stem cell research, and we'll look at that briefly. The role of the nervous system also has a stronger understanding of the biological systems and the pattern of abnormal behavior. And then particularly it has they like to look at the molecular level and the cell communication, in particular neurons. So when we think in terms of genetics and how traits are passed on from generation to generation, that affects how we look, how we behave, and how we function, this is what's known as hereditary, and it's a genetic process. The human genome, all the genetic material encoded in DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA is the molecular structure of the genome, comprised of 4 organic compounds, and they're known as A, T, C, G. A is adenine, T is thymine, C is cytosine, and G is guanine. And all genetic material is made up of these 4 compounds in different orders and different configurations. There's 2.8 billion pairs and 20 to 25,000 genes. And so in terms of the genetic component, it's these potential genetic errors when the number or the sequence of the DNA pairs are in some way wrong. This could lead to bodily structures and functions becoming abnormal or failing. Now on page 19, you'll see this particular image. And part of what I want to address here is the epigenome. This is the molecular structure that overlays the genome and plays an important part in gene regulation. In particular, gene expression, or genes that, elements that are turned on, or gene silencing, which is the opposite, and some gene elements are turned off. Epigenetics is providing insights into the origin and the course of many psychological disorders. So we're getting into a much, much smaller elements of human existence, into these small bits and pieces. Now stem cells, well, these become very important as well, because stem cells, these are the cells that can divide, develop into a diverse variety of more specialized cells. And they can renew and to create more stem cells. They're just like these little wonders. So a single stem cell that can divide and replicate itself, or it can differentiate itself into heart tissue, skin cells, neurons. I mean, it's a very, very important type of cell. So many discoveries are being made and will continue to be made with the growth of epigenetics and stem cell research in terms of our understanding of abnormal psychology. Now, still sticking with the biological perspective, we can move into the nervous system. And the nervous system is made up of nerve cells called neurons. And neurons, they transmit or communicate to each other things like how we make our movements, how we think, our writing, our drawing, creativity, even hallucinations, audio and visual. And so the way that they communicate is what makes us, us. Every neuron has a cell body, and it's known as a soma. And it contains a nucleus and carries out metabolic or life-sustaining functions of a neuron. Now the dendrites, these project out of the cell bodies and are the primary receivers of signals from other neurons. The axon, this is a tail-like extension of the neuron, and it transmits signals to other neurons. And at the end of the axons are these axon terminals. Signals move from the axon terminals to the dendrites and cell bodies of other neurons, and therefore to the muscles, the glands, and other parts of the body. Swellings called knobs occupy the tips of the terminals. So each neuron has a soma, a dendrite, an axiom, a terminal, and a knob. Now I've posted a video for you that has these very up-to-date animations of chromosomes and how they replicate. You might find it interesting. It's not required watching, but you might find it interesting. Now, I've mentioned already about neuron communication. If we look at it more closely, you'll find this on page 21. Neurons communicate with each other by a means of a chemical substance called neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters are critical to how they communicate. This diagram you'll find in your textbook. The synapse is the junction point between two neurons. One's transmitting and the other is receiving. Each neurotransmitter has a distinctive chemical structure, and it will only fit in one receptor site on the receiving neuron. It's kind of like puzzle pieces fitting together, or a key in a lock. Only one fits in one location. Any malfunctions or mistakes that occur in these neurotransmitters in the brain can be linked to various mental health problems. And so just this very minute, unseen almost level, we haven't got the equipment that allows us to see this occurring. We can create animations, but it's at a very small level at which this occurs that could be the kind of source of problem for abnormal behavior. Now, if we look a little closer at neurotransmitters, as was mentioned, these are chemicals that release into the sympathetic cleft from the axon terminal of the sending neuron, and a variety of neurotransmitters. And what are the functions of some of the major transmitters? Well, there's three right there, and I'll mention a fourth. Acetylcholine, ACTH, is involved in learning, movement, and memory. When there's reduced levels of this neurotransmitter, it's associated with Alzheimer's disease. Dopamine affects movement, attention, learning, reinforcement, and excessive levels of the neurotransmitter dopamine appears to be involved in schizophrenia. Then there's the norepinephrine and epinephrine, which help regulate eating and metabolism and alertness, and excesses and deficiencies in this neurotransmitter have been connected to mood disorders and eating disorders. You're starting to see, I think, a wee bit of a relationship between the neurotransmitter and how it affects the body normally, but therefore how it can affect the body abnormally. Glutamate is the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter, and serotonin and GABA help us sleep, while glutamate helps us stay awake. Serotonin, another neurotransmitter, is linked to anxiety disorders, mood disorders, sleep disorders, and eating disorders. Endorphins are natural painkillers, and they can contribute to our sense of feeling pleasure and well-being. Now, these are all different neurotransmitters, and the role that they play, or the lack of their ability to play these roles, can affect mental health and problem areas. So that's just a quick overview of the biological perspective. We're going to move to the psychological perspective. And one of the fathers of the psychological perspective is Sigmund Freud and his model of the psychodynamic model. And this perspective reflects the view of Freud and his followers, who believe that abnormal behavior stems from psychological causes involving underlying psychic forces. Freud developed the psychoanalysis as a means of uncovering the unconscious conflicts dating back to childhood that he believed were at the root of mental disorders such as hysteria. Freud found that he could treat hysteria by tracing each symptom back to its root cause, often involved early relationships with parents. Now, he developed what he called the structure of the mind. He divided it into three parts: the conscious mind, the preconscious mind, and the unconscious mind. The unconscious mind involved impulses and repressed and primitive urges, whereas the preconscious was just outside of our awareness, but it's accessible through attention and focus. And then the conscious mind is our current awareness. And as you and I are sitting, you're watching this video, me making this video, that's our current awareness. But if I asked you about your brothers, your sisters, your parents, it may not be in your current awareness, but because I asked you and it's a prompt reminder, you focus your attention on that, that would be your preconscious. All your life experiences aren't something that's currently in your awareness. It's something that can be brought up, and that's the preconscious. Now, the other thing that he introduced was psychic structures of personality, and he described three of them: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id, which is the source of basal drives and impulses, hunger, thirst, sex, aggression, are completely in the unconscious. Now, there's two principles, or one principle actually, that drives this, which is the pleasure principle, instant gratification of instinct. Now, social norms and concern for others are not considered at this point, not in the id. It is your sort of unabashed impulses and urges that considers not what other people want or need and only looks at oneself. Now, the primary process thinking in the id relates to the world in fantasy and imagination. Therefore, id can meet its needs through creating mental images. Now, the second degree, or the second area, is that of ego. This is the conscience part of the mind. Present awareness and attempts to manage the id's influence with good sense. So even though the id is influencing our everyday experience, it's our ego that sort of tries to manage that in the world that we live in. Therefore, the id can get its needs met, but not risk social disapproval. The ego is governed by the reality principle. What is practical, what is possible of the id's impulses and urges? That's what the reality principle is doing. And then the secondary process thinking that occurs in the ego is the executive functions between the id, the impulses, and the realities of the outside world. It aids in the development of the conscious sense of self. And then the superego, this is our moral selves. These are influenced from our parents and lessons they taught us on how to behave, what's right and what's wrong, and the internalization through identification of who we are in the world that we're in. So the moral principle is what rules the superego. The moral standards of our lives is what's influencing. And so when these things go wrong in our background, in our history, that this is what Freud's perspective introduced the potential for psychological disorders. Now, on page 24, you're going to find this list of defense mechanisms, and when the ego fights a continual battle to stay up on top of the ego's impulses and the superego's, moral principle, occasionally the conflicts that exist produce anxiety that threaten or overwhelm the ego. The ego remembers your conscious awareness. And this anxiety is a signal that alerts the ego to gather up its defense mechanisms, the unconscious protective process that to keep the primitive emotions associated with conflicts in check so the ego can continue coordinating a reality function. Sometimes they're adaptive and helpful, sometimes they're maladaptive and unhelpful. So for example, you can look at repression as an example, and its description, what it does is it expunges all from your current awareness any unacceptable ideas or motives. If something occurred in your background that you don't, it's not healthy or good for you, then repression would keep it from your awareness. A person remains unaware of harboring hateful or destructive impulses towards others. Denial, refusal to recognize a threatening impulse or desire. A person who harshly rebukes his or her spouse but denies feeling angry. You're angry. No, I'm not. That sort of denial. It's a defense mechanism in order to cope. But if these don't go, if these aren't used in a healthy sort of a manner, they become problematic. Now, if we move from Freud and psychodynamics, we can move into a more behavioralist approach. And we can start with Ivan Pavlov. He started with what is known as classical association or classical learning. And it's a behavior therapy that's outgrowth from the learning model. And essentially, you can learn things through association. And so, for example, you can learn to smile at your parents by the association that your parents provide you good things. They smile at you, you smile back. There's an association that we start to learn that our parents are worthy of our smiles and we of theirs. But you can also make other associations, and so some things around fetishes, for example, are based on associations. Sexual arousal with items and people that are not normally sexually arousable, that those associations that you make can create abhorrent or abnormal behavior. Now, alternatively, this is Pavlov's experiment that he did with dog and trying to associate the bell ringing with dog salivation. And this was back in the 1840s, I think, 1830s, I've forgotten now. Then we get to Watson, John B. Watson, and he initiated an experiment to prove fear could be classically conditioned. And this was in 1919. And he did an experiment that was known as Little Albert.
But not everyone believes that biology is destiny. For many scientists, it's your experiences in life that count. Your upbringing, your education, your environment. Chief among these scientists is psychologist John Watson, who offers a theory that is the mirror opposite of eugenics.
This was the heyday of hereditarians and geneticists who said that human beings were constrained by their genetic inheritance. And Watson was saying that this is baloney, that human beings were shaped solely by their environment.
Over the years, Watson studies the behavior of babies, hundreds of them. To Watson, we arrive in the world a blank slate, tabula rasa. Nearly everything is learned, even things we think are instinctual, like fear. To prove that environment is more powerful than genetics, Watson designs an experiment for an infant known as Little Albert. He's so confident, he films it for posterity. At first, Albert shows little fear, even when Watson places a burning newspaper in front of him. Albert is also unafraid when he encounters a white rat for the first time in his life. But then, Watson shows Albert the rat accompanied by a loud clanging noise. One of the few things that upsets little Albert. And he does it again. And does it again. Eventually, Albert learns to fear not just the rat, but all furry things, even without the loud noise. In Watson's mind, the Little Albert experiment is a success because it proves that fears are learned, not inherited. Watson calls his theory behaviorism and begins to popularize it. He urges parents to take active control of their children's upbringing by shaping their environment. To think of the home as a scientific laboratory.
So as you can see, there's a potential. This is back quite a number of years ago. So the idea of association, you could argue, and it is argued, that how many other potential associations could be made in early childhood that could articulate themselves and demonstrate themselves and make life more difficult for people as they grew older. Skinner, B.F. Skinner, is an operant conditioner. He looks at behavior operantly, which is a type of learning in which the consequence of behavior can be manipulated in order to increase or decrease the frequency of response. Ultimately, you could shape a new response. A lot of our education system is based on some of Skinner's work. You don't learn the entire alphabet all at once. You learn bits and pieces, and you shape it into what is now known as, the English language or as writing. And so there could be the potential to reinforce behaviors that can be appropriate, good and healthy, and inappropriate, bad and unhealthy. Let's look at that a little bit more carefully. Now here's an example of conditioning before. This is based on Pavlov's work, where the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, you don't condition yourself to enjoy food and have a response of food, that when you're hungry and someone puts food in front of you, like in this example of a dog, the dog starts to salivate. So the food is unconditioned. You don't have to teach that. Unconditioned stimulus. The salivation response is an unconditioned response. Then you go to number 2, and you associate a whistle, which has no real association to it. It's a neutral stimulus. The dog has no particular conditioned response. It doesn't salivate. So that's before conditioning. Now, if during conditioning we associate the whistle and the food together, so whenever the food is presented, the whistle is kind of like whenever little Albert was with a white rat, there was a clang, then the dog will salivate because it's unconditioned response to the food. But because the whistle and food are offered at the same time, the dog, after conditioning, will start to salivate after the whistle. The whistle becomes the conditioned stimulus. The dog has a conditioned response to the whistle that it before had no response to. And so that's the premise of, well, maybe there are things that we've associated and have had happen at the same time that get conditioned to be a part of an unconditioned, or a conditioned response. So, for example, if I were to say the word psychology, that's a conditioned stimulus, that is paired with a loud noise, an unconditioned stimulus, so that when it's associated with that noise, it becomes a conditioned response. So I could then bring up the word psychology and it would give you a negative response. Or if you look at phobias, some phobias are brought about this way. You know, if you've had no phobic response or no negative experience with a dog, and then every time, you know, you sort of met up with a dog, this dog would bark at you really loudly and bare its teeth, you'd start to make a conditioned response to that dog, and it might generalize to other dogs. So there's a number of factors that can influence classical conditioning. The number of pairings of the conditioned stimulus to the unconditioned stimulus can make a difference. The intensity of the unconditioned stimulus. How reliable the conditioned stimulus predicts the unconditioned stimulus. There's a number of elements that can influence classical conditioning. Now, if we look at it from an operant conditioning perspective, in Skinner's work, the type of learning in which the consequences of the behavior, can either increase or decrease depending upon the reinforcer, anything that follows the response and strengthens it increases the probability that it's going to occur. So if a child misbehaves and we punish the child, but the child's behavior keeps increasing, keeps getting stronger, then whether we like it or not, somehow what we're doing to punish the child is reinforcing to the child. Otherwise, that behavior wouldn't get more. So when we look at positive reinforcement, which is on the top, and negative reinforcement on the bottom, what's interesting is that you can have positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. You can have positive punishing and negative punishing. It doesn't have to do with severity. It has to do with whether you are adding something pleasant and desirable, which is positive reinforcement, or adding something unpleasant to try to reduce a behavior, which is punishment. Or if you're avoiding something unpleasant, that's negative reinforcement, or removing something valued or desirable, which is negative punishment. And it's important to recognize that reinforcement and punishment is usually not broken up in quite the way that you think. And that's why it's important to put it out that way. Now we're going to move into a humanistic approach, and one of the ones we're going to tackle here is a Canadian out of York University, Dr. Leslie Greenberg, and he does what's called emotion-focused therapy and emotional intelligence. Essentially, if we can handle experiences and express ourselves and our emotions in a healthy manner in coping with the life experiences, then we are generally healthier and happier. If we fail to manage our emotional strengths and the emotions that we have, we could essentially risk our health, both physically and emotionally. And so the importance was the role of emotions in our lives and our emotional intelligence, if you will, to be able to manage it well. And that when we don't, it can have dire effects. Social cognitive theory, again, we're still into psychological, and this is still along cognitive theory. And this is Albert Bandura. Learning by observing the behaviors of others and the consequences of behavior, which is also known as learning vicariously. I don't need to learn to touch, the stove is hot when it's on. I just need to see you touch the stove when it's on to see the consequences, and then I can learn not to touch it myself. And so for many children, and for that matter adults, it involves imitation. Now he introduced what he called reciprocal determinism. And this is, how does our behavior both act on and is influenced by our personal environment and personal and environmental factors. So there's this relationship between personal, behavior, and environment and how they interact with one another. And they don't all interact the same. If I live in a very healthy environment and I see myself in a good way, then chances are my behavior is good as well. However, if I'm in a less than positive environment, if I'm in a bad environment with bad people who treat me badly and I don't think I'm very good, it shouldn't surprise anybody that my behavior may not be very good either. So influencing factors in factors is expectancy, our personal variable about how do we expect or make predictions about outcomes. If we have a particularly positive view, then we may see that the future is good for us, whereas if we don't have a particularly positive view, we may not see that the future is very good for us. Carrying on with the cognitive perspective, we have Albert Ellis, and the cognitive theorist focuses on the role of distorted and self-defeating thinking in explaining abnormal behavior, and he introduced what he called rational emotive behavior therapy, REBT, where you're looking at the activating events, what is occurring, the beliefs associated with what was occurring, and therefore the consequences that comes out of that activating event and belief. It's an action-oriented psychotherapy that teaches individuals to identify, challenge, and replace their self-defeating thoughts and beliefs with healthier thoughts that promote emotional well-being and goal achievement. Now, these are more newer approaches to psychological disorders, and one of the more current ones is by Donald Mickelbaum, Dr. Donald Mickelbaum out of Waterloo University, and he introduced what he called cognitive behavior management. And in this particular theory, he's looking at the relationship between thoughts that we create and the feelings that are created by the behaviors that we have, and those behaviors that reinforce the thoughts. So it becomes somewhat of a cycle. That cycle can be broken, but it is a cycle nonetheless. So those are a collection of more current psychological perspectives. And we'll move to the third group. This group is now what's called sociocultural perspective. In this group, we have where the theorists believe that abnormal behavior is rooted in the social ills, such as poverty, societal stress, institutionalized prejudice, discrimination, but it's not the individual themselves. They believe that to eliminate abnormality, one must first correct the societal problems that caused it. Some sociocultural theorists argue that mental illness is a myth, and we really just need to look at the societal standards, because those people who don't fit the societal standards are who are being identified as having mental illness. Now, there is another term that's used. It's called drift hypothesis, downward drift hypothesis, concerning the relationship between mental illness and social class. It's the argument that illness causes one to have a downward shift in social class. The circumstances of one's social class don't cause the onset of mental illness, but rather it's the individual's deteriorating health that occurs first, resulting in lower social class attainment. And then lastly, but not least, is the interactionalist perspective. And there's no one theoretical perspective that can account for the complex forms of abnormal behavior, but many theorists today adopt the interactionist view. They believe they need to take into account the interaction of multiple factors representing biological, psychological, sociocultural, environmental domains in order to explain abnormal behavior. Today, many theorists believe in multiple factors interacting in complex ways to involve the development of abnormal behavior patterns. The leading interactionalist model is the diathesis stress model, and it posits that some people have a predisposition towards particular disorders. Whether these disorders actually develop really have a lot to do with the kind of circumstances and stresses they find themselves having. This bottom example is to show you on the left, there's the diathesis, or the genetic vulnerability, is the darker brown at the bottom of the glass. The stressors, life events, are the next shade of brown, and at the top that red line indicates whether or not a disorder materializes or not. And if you look at the two glasses on the left, or sorry, on the right, you have person one. This person becomes an alcoholic, whereas person two doesn't. And you notice that the one big difference isn't so much the stressor, that appears to be relatively the same for both, but one has more genetic tendency to become alcoholic than the other. And so even though they have the same amount of stress in their life, the predisposition for the one on the left increases the likelihood that they become alcoholic, whereas the one on the right does not become alcoholic. And this isn't just for alcoholism. This is for a lot of different disorders that is argued that some people have more of a predisposition towards or diathesis towards a particular disorder. And that those life stressors that might be the same as somebody else materialize for that person, whereas it doesn't for the other. Okay, I hope this has been helpful. That's the end of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 will begin to look at the issues of, we're going to look at the issues of assessment. How do we decide and assess and classify and treat abnormal behavior? And that will be Chapter 2. So I hope you're enjoying this. I hope this is getting off to a good start. I hope the videos are helpful for you. And let's get started, and hopefully we'll get going on week 2 very shortly. Bye now, everybody.